Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna discuss about layering, what it is, why I don't like it, the possible problems and outcomes of orchid medium layering, overall explain why I don't believe layering of orchid substrate and even roots, we're gonna dip into bare root as well, doesn't make for an efficient way of growing orchids. Okay, so first let's start with explaining what I mean with layering. Okay, so by layering of an orchid pot or orchid medium or orchid roots, I refer to how water evaporates when it comes to the length of the pot or the root system of an orchid. Water evaporates faster at the top of a pot than at the bottom. It has to do with gravity pull, with contact surface with air, with the capillarity or water absorption of a certain medium. Overall, the final outcome is that many times we can get an orchid pot which is very dry towards the top of the pot and very wet towards the bottom. Now, this phenomenon can pose certain problems. So let's start with the beginning of my orchid hobby and tell you the problems that I encountered then. So 2, 3, 4 years ago, I was using traditional bark medium or sphagnum moss medium, pretty much organic medium. As you might already know, bark chips are not the greatest when it comes to capillarity, meaning absorption of water from a particular place in the pot and directing it to other places. For example, sucking water from the bottom of the pot and directing it upwards. Because of the big surface area at the top of the pot, water would evaporate really fast at the top, and not only, all the upper layers will start to evaporate given a certain amount of time, while the lower layers would still be very wet. The problem I was facing back then as an orchid beginner was, when should I water my orchid? I knew that Phalaenopsis orchids should be watered when the roots are dry, but in my case, part of the roots were very dry, already shriveling, and part of the roots were very wet. At the time, I kind of resolved the problem with adding ventilation holes. These are spaces where water can evaporate from the sides as well, and that greatly reduced layering issues, but it didn't make them disappear completely. Overall, I could live with it and I could perform a more correct watering. But when it comes to organic medium, when to water is not the only issue layering can pose. All organic media decomposes after a while, but there are certain things that can accelerate decomposition. And the best one is water. The more moist organic medium stays, the faster it decomposes. Bacterial and microbial activity is also accelerated and the decomposition rate is greater. So letting an orchid pot layer might mean that the lower layers will start to decompose faster than the upper layers. So let's say that the average time of decomposition of an average bark chip medium is about 2 years. If the bottom stays always wet, it might accelerate the process and decompose that part of the medium within 1 year or even faster, depending on the medium. So what I would have ended up with is decomposed medium at the bottom and still usable medium at the surface. Now that's a little bit more dangerous than it sounds. Due to greater colonies of bacteria and microbes at the bottom and more water retention on the lower layers, it kind of accelerated the decomposition rate of the upper layers as well, bit by bit. The more water I had at the bottom, the more the middle layers started to retain water and decompose as well, and then the upper layers followed. So from this point of view, layering is very inefficient because it can reduce the life of your organic medium. We need to take into account how fast our medium is decomposing. If it's decomposing too fast, well, that's pretty much a waste, isn't it? And the more we disturb an orchid's roots, the more we have chances to actually stale it, if we manage to damage the roots. Not to mention that if the medium is breaking down and it becomes very acidic, parts of the roots within that medium will start to be affected as well. So we can also end up with some damaged roots or root loss. Overall, layering is more prone to happen with those types of medium which do not have great capillarity, such as bark chips. When it comes to sphagnum moss, things are not like that. Sphagnum moss can direct moisture from the bottom to the top and stay pretty much even. And I did do this experiment, you can watch it down below. I'll link you to an older video in which we are watering the Neofinetia fulcata potted only in moss. So when it comes to practicality reasons, layering is not really efficient at all. It can be both dangerous and costly. Now, when it comes to inorganic medium, these issues will not apply because inorganic medium does not decompose. Also, the medium available on the market right now is pretty good at diverting water from the bottom to the top. Well, of course, depending on the material. For example, leca is not the most efficient thing on the planet when it comes to capillarity, but Ceramis is. However, leca can aerate the overall medium. So the compromise I am using right now is a mixture between Ceramis and leca. Ceramis will help with layering, will help with water retention and distribution, while leca provides airiness and spaces for the roots to grow in. But even so, layering can happen. When we are referring to a plastic pot, layering is pretty obvious. Plastic doesn't let air have contact with the medium, thus providing extra ventilation holes helps, but it doesn't help completely. Therefore, I am limiting the surface contact with air as well, and at the moment I think I can stay on top with the layering issues as best as possible. It's not 100% perfect, but it is a heck of a lot better than if I would have used a plastic pot with no ventilation holes and no pebble layer. But since I don't have issues with the composition of medium, what could my issue be in inorganic medium? Well, first of all, new roots don't appreciate very dry meat, so I would need to put the effort into spraying the top every once in a while. It's not a big effort, but when you have 200 orchids, it can become a chore. So when it comes to watering, layering can pose some issues in inorganic medium as well. This, however, depends on the type of orchid we have. If we have a type of orchid which doesn't really mind staying very moist, then things are pretty easy. But when it comes to an orchid that would get affected by too much moisture, then we need to be a little bit more careful. So until now, I've talked about practicality reasons, health of the roots reasons, but now let's take it one step further and talk about performance of the orchid and how layering can affect the performance of our orchids. And this is something that kind of hit me recently, let's say for a few weeks. Now, performance of an orchid is a very subjective thing. Some people consider performance if an orchid manages to bloom at all. Doesn't matter the bloom count, the quality of the blooms, while other people are not necessarily impressed by a few flowers and are looking for more than that. The quantity and quality of orchid blooms depend on many things, and they are always related to stress factors, disease, environmental issues, care issues, and so on. But there are instances where we can provide all of the things necessary for an orchid's well-being and still we get less than ideal results. Again, I want to insist on the fact that this is very personal. To better exemplify this, let's see some Phalaenopsis orchids. I think all orchid growers do have a few Phalaenopsis in their collection, and like everybody else, I did have a few as well. Now, when a Phalaenopsis reblooms, it's really not uncommon to get 4, 5, 6 blooms. And for a beginner, this is spectacular and it's quite enough. But the thing is, Phalaenopsis orchids, complex hybrids, the ones we find on the market, are designed to bloom a little bit better than that. Therefore, when we purchase Phalaenopsis orchids, we can get a multitude of blooms. We can get 10, 15 blooms. We can get double spikes. We can get branching spikes. And sometimes we cannot obtain all of these things in our home. Now, what could be the reason for that? Most common reasons include care issues or environment issues or stress issues, but sometimes it implies nutrition issues. And when I say nutrition issues, I don't necessarily mean if you fertilize the orchid or not. Of course, if you don't fertilize it, the outcome might not be as expected, but how you fertilize is also important. And here's my performance issue with layering. So let's consider that we fertilize our orchid. We usually either soak the pot, either try to run water from the top of the pot, not the top of the orchid, but from the top of the pot, and then we get some layering. Well, what happens to that fertilized water? Well, first of all, in the layers that dry up pretty fast, the fertilizer is not absorbed in time and it deposits on the surfaces and on the medium itself. Thus, the idea of flushing our orchid pots becomes important. But what happens in the lower layers? Well, because of the humidity, orchid roots can actually absorb whatever nutrient is left there a little better. The more an orchid has contact with fertilizer dissolved in liquid, the more time it has to absorb it. And that is not a bad thing, provided we do offer fertilizer in the recommended dosages and we don't overdo it. Therefore, if layering happens in our orchid pot, we have an uneven distribution of fertilizer. meaning the sections of the roots which are on top of the pot do not benefit of the fertilizer in the same way that the roots on the bottom. And if we have excessive layering, the top portion of the roots absorb no fertilizer while the bottom does. Now, how can that translate into performance? And mind you, this is just a theory and a detail that I'm starting to consider important. Well, simply human instinct. We know instinctively that if something doesn't function at full capacity, it does not yield full capacity results. For example, an airplane usually is designed to fly with 2 engines to perform at full capacity. But also an airplane can function with only 1 engine running. Will it perform at its full capacity? No, and can even pose some threats. But not only machinery and devices are affected by certain components not performing at full capacity. Let us think about the human body. If all of our organs perform at full capacity, we will perform overall at our full capacity as well. If one of our organs doesn't perform as it should be, it doesn't mean we will not still perform. It just means, though, that we might not be able to perform certain activities at full capacity, if at all. It doesn't mean we will not perform at all. Therefore, I am inclined to believe that when it comes to orchid roots, an uneven performance will also reflect on the overall performance. If a section of the root that stays in fertilized water performs normally and absorbs those nutrients, the section that stays in dried medium does not benefit from the fertilizer and does not absorb it. Now, of course, the root development has great capillary properties as well, but they are not limitless. If you have some experience with orchids, you already know that if you put a layer of water at the bottom of a container and you put the orchid roots inside, they will divert that moisture to the top. Depending on the level of water, they can divert the moisture all the way to the top, or they can stop somewhere along the way. Nonetheless, they will get hydration and they will benefit from whatever nutrients that water has. But the absorption rate is limited. An orchid that can absorb nutrients with the whole mass of the roots will absorb more nutrients overall than an orchid which absorbs nutrients only with a section of the root system. Well, it can translate into a lower than ideal quantity of nutrients that the orchid absorbs. It can also mean a waste of fertilizer. Therefore, you can see why I'm starting to believe there is an efficiency issue with layering. Now, this doesn't only apply to potted orchids. It also applies to bare root orchids. And here's where the personal aspect comes. When we're starting out with orchids, our main interest is to maintain the orchid alive and to maintain it healthy. If it blooms, we're happy. How many blooms? Well, it really doesn't matter. But the more we stay into the hobby, the more we have different aspirations. We are starting to not get so impressed by 6 blooms, and we start looking for more. We start looking for branches, and we start looking for bigger flower count. Pretty much we are starting to look for performance. We kind of start forgetting about that motto that says if it's not broken, don't fix it. And pretty much that kind of sums up the idea of why I don't like layering. What if this little detail actually means the difference between having okay results and having great results? Well, this is something I'm trying to figure out right now. Instinctively, I think it matters. Practically, I don't know, that shall remain to be seen. But I don't think you can deny that the fact of the entirety of the root system is capable of performing certain functions. If we impair those functions, there might be some consequences. Whether we see the consequences or not, I am not sure, and it might only depend on what you want from an orchid. And to sum it all up, whatever setup you choose and however you choose to grow your orchids, if it pleases your expectations, then everything is okay. But at the same time, we kind of need to understand that other people have other expectations or other goals. And thinking about these details that absolutely don't matter, let's say, in the well-being of orchids, is something we choose to do in order to see if it makes any visible difference. The basic care for that orchid should provide your expectations. If you want a little bit more, then maybe it's time to look into the details and assess how every little detail can affect the performance of an orchid. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you found this useful. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchids and plants videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye! And here I have an example of what I'm talking about. So here I have a Phalaenopsis orchid with quite a lot of blooms. It's blooming nicely, wouldn't you say? Well, I disagree. This is not the full capacity of the orchid. Now, mind you, this orchid has some reasons why it doesn't bloom at full capacity. And you can see that by looking at the orchid. This is the one I presented last summer with the severe sunburn. I'll add the link down below. If you look at the state of the orchid back then and now, there is quite the difference. But this amount of stress took a toll on flowering. And of course, it is a beautiful flower display. I think I counted 15 buds, but it's not the full potential. We can do better than that. And by offering no more stress and sunburn, we are closer to achieving the goal.